All right, and we're back with more of Section 6 policy implementation. Now, how do agencies actually make rules? Right? Well, first off, they have to look at both their constituents and their clients. And there's a difference between those two words. I know they kind of seem similar, constituency and client, but they are different. So, agencies' clients are the actual people or businesses or organizations they're serving, right? So, the Social Security Administration, their clients would be the seniors in the United States that are receiving checks every month. The Department of Veterans Affairs, their clients would be the veterans who are receiving services. Whereas constituents are everybody, including clients, that has kind of interest in what's going on. So other federal agencies, the president, Congress, etc., depending on which agency and all those things. And this is dynamic, right? This changes over time based on what kind of policy we're talking about, what particular job of that agency they're doing. So, the constituents for NASA might include the president and vice president at certain times for certain things, if it's, a matter of national pride or national importance. But it also includes things like the Environmental Protection Agency, when rockets or new launch pads might impact the environment. And you wouldn't think of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission having much to do with NASA, but occasionally NASA will send something radioactive into space, right? When we send deep space probes far away from the sun, we need to power them with nuclear power. So in those instances, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy become a constituent of NASA because they have input in how NASA does things for those specific missions. But then, just a trip to the International Space Station that doesn't involve nuclear power at all, the Department of Energy is not part of NASA's constituency, right? And any given agency wants to kind of make sure that they maintain political support and political power. So they want the constituents to be happy. They want their clients to be happy. They want to gather support for different policies and different goals and different missions and different programs, and kind of keeping these constituents and the clients happy, and telling them, hey, if you don't like this policy, write your congressman, write the president, etc. That is a big goal when they're making rules, when they're making, with how they're implementing certain policies. All right, so there are lots of different factors that go into exactly how and why different agencies make decisions, right? One of those is hierarchy. If somebody up the ladder of command says, you're going to do it this way, you're probably going to say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, I'll do it that way, right? So maybe it's the president saying, hey, this agency, you need to do things this way. You need to implement it in this manner. This rule needs to look like this. Maybe it's the cabinet secretary. Maybe it's the bureau head. Maybe it's, just somebody further up the chain than the person actually charged with making that decision. And because these agencies are organized in this hierarchy, people higher up get to kind of have any influence they want, or more influence in certain cases, in what the people lower down the chain get to decide about how rules are going to look, how policies are implemented, what standards are going to be, what limits are going to be, etc. Agency decisions are also affected massively by visibility. Is this something that the public is paying attention to, right? So NASA, again, is one of my favorite examples here, has a lot of visibility. There are lots of people kind of looking at every decision they make. Whereas somebody like, the Department of Energy, looking at where they're going to do a new solar power plant, has much less kind of visibility, and the public isn't paying as much attention. But then, say, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, if there's a big hurricane that hits a major city, they're going to have a lot of visibility on how they do that and how they implement it. But a relatively minor thing that is not making national news, they're going to have much less visibility, and that can affect what they do and how they do it. Important to discuss here is FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act. This was a law passed many decades ago, long before most of you were born, I'm sure, that says that essentially if a private citizen asks any U.S. government agency for information about something, the government agency in charge has to give them what they want, the information they're after, unless they can justify not doing it for, national security reasons or private information reasons. In other words, it says, the default is the government has to give that information to any member of the public that asks, unless they can prove why they shouldn't. Whereas before, it was agencies didn't have to give any information out to the private citizens unless those private citizens could demonstrate cause why they needed to, right? So it kind of flipped the standard of what the default is for private citizens getting any information they want from different federal agencies and organizations. Of course, science comes into play when agencies are making decisions, right? Especially with the more scientific groups and organizations like NASA and the EPA and the Department of Energy, et cetera, et cetera. If they're going to make a rule, they're going to make a decision, they're going to make a standard, they're going to go to the kind of expert scientists in that field and say, hey, what does the research say about what we should do here? How do we need to set this water pollution standard? How much thrust are we going to need in this new rocket we're building, etc. So the scientific and technical aspects of whatever decision they're making or whatever rule they're creating is obviously going to play a big part in how that decision is made. And then, of course, there's just bargaining, right? We're making a rule that, two groups have opposing views. One group says we need to be really strict and set really high standards, and another group says, no, we need to, low standards or no standards at all. And so the agency might kind of bargain and figure out a way to make both groups not necessarily completely happy, but, kind of find that good compromise between those two positions, whether it's the group they're making the rule about, or maybe two different federal agencies both want to kind of make two different decisions on how this policy is implemented. They both have kind of shared responsibility for that policy. So those two government agencies might have to bargain and compromise on how this is going to work and what rules are going to be set, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're talking about rules, when we're talking about kind of the standards and the specific rules and language of how things are going to be implemented, there are three kinds. There's the substantive, the interpretive, and the procedural, right? Substantive rules are setting some kind of standard. They're changing some kind of rule. They're saying, the Congress has asked us to limit air pollution. So we are going to set a substantive rule that no power plant can release more than this amount of sulfur into the atmosphere per year. Interpretive rules are rules saying, hey, this law passed by Congress was a little vague. Here's how we're choosing to interpret it, right? So we could use, Congress passed a law saying that NASA has to send a probe to explore Mars by 2030. Okay, well, we're going to interpret explore as orbit or land or send a rover, right? So Congress said something a little bit vague, and we're going to say that what they meant by explore was this, right? And then, of course, there's the procedural. And the procedural rules are about how stuff works. So, we're going to make this substantive rule about air pollution, and this is the limit for a given power plant. The procedural rule might say, here's how we're going to do the investigations, the inspections. That's the word I'm looking for. And if a given power plant disagrees with the findings of that investigation or that inspection, here's how they can go through an appeals process and who will hear their appeals. So this is kind of about how things are going to work, how the process of this rule or this standard or this policy is going to work. All right, so when an agency makes a new rule, okay, this could be the EPA setting new environmental standards. This could be NASA making a rule about which private company they're going to buy rockets from. Could be lots of different things. There's a process in how they make that decision and how they make that rule that must be followed. First, they have to post notice. Hey, we're going to make a decision on this standard. We're going to make a decision on this policy. We're going to make a decision on who to buy rockets from. Then they have to be open for a comment period where theoretically anybody can make a comment on this, say, hey, I think the rule should be this because, or hey, make sure you take this into account. But really the only kind of comments they usually get are from the organizations or companies that will be affected by that rule. Then they have to put out a statement of basis in their decision and the purpose of their decision. So we are going to make this rule. This is why we made that rule. This is the purpose we have for making this rule or setting this standard. Kind of explaining their reasoning and how they either are going to make the decision or did make the decision. Then they have to submit every decision to a cost-benefit analysis. You know, if we make this new rule, or if this new rule goes into effect, how much is this going to cost? What benefits is it likely to give us, etc. And then finally, they have to post notice at least a certain number of days before that rule goes into effect or before that decision kind of becomes final. And that kind of allows the organizations affected to make an appeal or read that statement of basis and purpose and kind of come to understand what's going to go on and what they're going to have to do or change or modify or submit in order to follow with this rule before that rule actually takes effect. All right. Two other ways that agencies kind of make rules. They can make rules through adjudication, i.e. A case-by-case basis, right? So the EPA might come through and say, we're going to investigate whether this certain organization has violated the vague rule about pollution. And instead of setting out specifics for that rule ahead of time, they just take that vague language by Congress, or even that vague language that they themselves have written, and then go in and investigate people that might have violated that rule, and then through this adjudication process say, yes, they did violate the rule, or no, they didn't violate the rule. And that kind of serves notice to other organizations or other groups that are worried about abiding by that rule, kind of where the limits are and how exactly that rule is going to be interpreted or enforced, right? So we can kind of look at the previous organizations or individuals that were in similar positions to ourselves and say, well, the relevant federal agency in this case that's very similar to ours ruled that they were okay because they did this certain thing, so as long as we do like that person, they should also rule that we were okay. Or, oh, that organization found this group to be in violation of a rule, so we better make sure we don't do what they did, right? So it's kind of rulemaking or setting standards or reaching that specificity through the process of kind of trial and error, and how are we going to rule in individual cases to kind of create this larger body or more specific set of rules and standards. And then, of course, there's making rules through enforcement, right? Whether an organization or an agency chooses to enforce things or not might not have much of an effect on formal rules, but it definitely has an impact on kind of how those rules are interpreted by the groups and organizations and individuals that those rules are supposed to apply to. So, the state government can say, oh, the speed limit on this highway is 65 miles an hour. But if there's never any police out there giving tickets to speeders, that rule kind of loses its power, right? And then when I drive on that, I'm not going to drive 65. Or if they only give tickets to people who are going 75 or over, that kind of informally turns the rule into make sure you're going 74 or lower, right? So whether something is enforced or not, or how often it's enforced, or exactly how it's enforced, can kind of informally set standards for different rules and regulations and such. All right, we're going to take one more break, and then we'll be back for the end of this section. Thank you.